The bitter December wind howled across the barren plains surrounding Denver, carrying with it the promise of another harsh Colorado winter. Snow had begun to dust the wooden sidewalks of the growing frontier town, where gas lamps flickered against the early twilight, but there was something else in the air that evening. Something that made the townspeople hurry past the imposing Whitmore estate with quickened steps and averted eyes. Thomas Hartwell pulled his wool coat tighter as he walked down Larimer Street, his reporter's instincts already stirring. At 26, he had seen enough of the world to recognize when a story was brewing, and the metallic, sweet scent that had been drifting from the Whitmore property for the past 3 days was unlike anything he had encountered in his years covering mining accidents and frontier disputes for the Denver Tribune. "Evening, Mr. Hartwell," called out Mrs. Eldona Prescott from her boarding house porch, her voice tight with worry. The elderly woman had been a fixture in Denver since the gold rush days, and Thomas had never seen her look so unsettled. "Mrs. Prescott?" Thomas tipped his hat, pausing at her gate. "That smell! How long has it been this strong?" The woman's weathered hands gripped her shawl tighter. "Started Sunday morning, right after church. Gets worse when the wind shifts toward town." She glanced nervously toward the Whitmore estate, its Gothic silhouette looming against the darkening sky about a quarter-mile away. "My late husband used to say some smells carry memories, Mr. Hartwell. This one, it carries death." Thomas felt a familiar tingle of curiosity. The Whitmore family had been Denver's most prominent residents since the silver boom began, their wealth built on mining claims that seemed to produce ore when others ran dry. Yet they remained mysteriously isolated, rarely seen in town except for essential business. The family patriarch, Cornelius Whitmore, was a gaunt man in his 60s who spoke little and smiled less. His wife, Vivian, had not been seen publicly in over 2 years, and their adult children, Marcus and Isabel, were equally reclusive. "Has anyone spoken to the family about it?" Thomas asked, pulling out his leather notebook. Mrs. Prescott shook her head vigorously. "Sheriff Morrison went by yesterday. Came back white as fresh snow and wouldn't say a word about what he saw. Just told folks to mind their own business and stay away from the property." The wind shifted again, and the smell intensified, a nauseating blend of copper and decay that seemed to coat the back of Thomas's throat. He had smelled death before, in the aftermath of mining cave-ins and frontier violence, but this was different, older, more complex. As Thomas walked toward the center of town, he noticed how the streets had emptied earlier than usual. The saloons that typically buzzed with activity were quieter, and even the hardy miners who feared little seemed eager to finish their business and retreat indoors. At Murphy's Tavern, Thomas found a small group of locals huddled around a corner table, their voices low and urgent. He recognized Jake Morrison, the sheriff's younger brother, along with Dr. Samuel Hayes, the town's physician, and Father Miguel Santos from the Catholic Church. "Gentlemen," Thomas approached their table. "Mind if I join you?" Dr. Hayes, a thin man with prematurely gray hair, looked up with haunted eyes. "Thomas, you're just the man we need to see. This situation with the Whitmores, it's beyond anything I've encountered in my medical practice." "What exactly did your brother see out there, Jake?" Thomas asked, settling into an empty chair. Jake Morrison was a stocky man in his 30s, known for his steady nerves and practical nature. Tonight, however, his hands trembled slightly as he lifted his whiskey glass. "Ben won't say much, but he came home yesterday evening and locked himself in his study. I heard him pacing all night, muttering prayers." Father Santos, a soft-spoken man who had ministered to the community for over a decade, leaned forward. "I've been asked to perform blessings before, Mr. Hartwell, but never for something like this. The sheriff requested holy water and specific prayers for protection against evil." "Evil?" Thomas's pen moved quickly across his notebook. "Those were his exact words?" "He said the smell wasn't just from something dead," Dr. Hayes interjected, his voice barely above a whisper. He said it was from something that should have stayed dead. The tavern fell silent, except for the crackling of the fireplace and the wind rattling the windows. Thomas felt the weight of their collective fear, but also the pull of the story that was clearly much larger than a simple case of poor sanitation. "I've been thinking about the history of that land," Father Santos continued. "Before Cornelius Whitmore bought it in 1862, it belonged to a trapper named Ezekiel Thorne. Local Arapaho tribes avoided the area, called it the place where spirits weep. Thorne disappeared one winter, and the land sat empty for 3 years before Whitmore purchased it." "What about the well?" Thomas asked. "I've heard rumors about an old stone well on the property." The men exchanged glances, and Jake leaned closer. "My grandfather helped build that well back in '58, before Thorne disappeared, said it was the strangest job he ever worked. Thorne insisted they dig down nearly 60 feet, far deeper than necessary for water. And when they hit something hard at the bottom, not rock but something else, Thorne made them stop and seal it with iron." "Iron?" Thomas raised an eyebrow. "Heavy iron plates, blessed by 3 different ministers," Jake continued. "Grandfather said Thorne paid them double to keep quiet about what they found down there, but he never forgot the look in the man's eyes. Pure terror." Dr. Hayes nodded grimly. "I've been researching old medical records from the territorial days. There were several unexplained deaths in the area between 1858 and 1862, all involving severe blood loss, but no visible wounds. The bodies were found drained as if—" He trailed off, unable to finish the thought. Thomas felt his pulse quicken. This was more than just a story about a bad smell. This was something that could make his career. "Gentlemen, I think it's time someone took a closer look at the Whitmore property. With your permission, I'd like to investigate this matter thoroughly." "Thomas," Father Santos placed a warning hand on his arm, "some mysteries are meant to remain buried. The Whitmore family has kept to themselves for good reason. Perhaps we should respect that." But Thomas's mind was already racing with possibilities. He had come to Denver to make a name for himself as a journalist, and this story, whatever it truly was, could be his ticket to the major newspapers back east. As the men continued their hushed conversation, none of them noticed the figure watching from the tavern's frost-covered window. Marcus Whitmore stood in the shadows across the street, his pale face barely visible in the gaslight. He had heard enough to know that their family's carefully guarded secret was beginning to unravel. The young man's breath formed clouds in the frigid air as he turned and walked quickly back toward the estate, his footsteps echoing hollowly on the frozen ground. Behind him, the wind carried that terrible smell deeper into town, and with it, the promise that Denver's peaceful winter was about to become something far more sinister. In the distance, the Whitmore mansion loomed against the star-filled sky, its windows dark, except for a single light in the basement, a light that had been burning continuously for 3 days, casting strange shadows that seemed to move independently of any flame. The Whitmore estate stood like a monument to prosperity and isolation, its Victorian architecture stark against the Colorado landscape. Built from imported stone and timber, the 3-story mansion featured elaborate gables and wraparound porches that had once suggested warmth and hospitality. Now, in the pale morning light, following Thomas's conversation at Murphy's Tavern, the house seemed to brood over its snow-covered grounds with an almost malevolent presence. Marcus Whitmore paced the length of the main parlor, his boots clicking against the polished hardwood floors. At 28, he possessed the lean build and sharp features characteristic of the Whitmore lineage, but the past 3 days had carved deep lines around his dark eyes and left his usually immaculate appearance disheveled. His sister Isabel sat rigidly in a high-backed chair near the fireplace, her pale hands folded in her lap, while their father Cornelius stood at the tall windows overlooking the grounds. "They know," Marcus said, breaking the tense silence that had dominated the house since dawn. "The reporter was asking questions last night. It's only a matter of time before—" "Before what?" Cornelius's voice cut through the air like a blade. At 63, the family patriarch remained an imposing figure despite his gaunt frame. His silver hair was pulled back severely, and his grey eyes held a coldness that had intimidated business rivals and family members alike for decades. Before they discover what we've sacrificed to build this empire, before they understand the price of our prosperity, Isabel, 25 and possessed of a beauty that had attracted numerous suitors, all of whom had been quietly discouraged, finally spoke. "Father, the smell is getting stronger. Even with the iron seal, something is changing down there. Mother hasn't left her room in 2 days, and the servants are beginning to whisper." The mention of their mother caused Cornelius's jaw to tighten. Vivian Whitmore had once been the toast of Denver society, her charm and grace complementing her husband's business acumen perfectly. But the past 2 years had seen her retreat deeper into herself, spending most of her time in the mansion's upper floors, speaking in whispers about voices that called to her from beneath the ground. "Your mother understands the burden we carry better than anyone," Cornelius replied, his gaze never leaving the window. "She was there when we made the pact. She knows what happens if we fail to honor it." Marcus stopped pacing and faced his father directly. "The pact was made 12 years ago when we were desperate. The mines were failing, our creditors were circling, and we had nothing left to lose. But look at us now. We're the wealthiest family in Colorado. Surely we've paid enough." "Paid enough?" Cornelius turned from the window, his expression a mixture of disbelief and fury. "You think wealth is all we've gained? You think the silver that flows from our mines is the only benefit of our arrangement?" He moved to an ornate desk in the corner of the room and withdrew a leather-bound ledger. The book's pages were yellowed with age, and strange symbols were carved into its cover, symbols that seemed to shift and writhe when viewed directly. "Every month for 12 years we have honored our agreement," Cornelius continued, opening the ledger to reveal columns of dates and cryptic notations. "And every month our prosperity has grown. Our mines produce when others fail. Our investments succeed when others collapse. Our enemies suffer mysterious misfortunes while we thrive." Isabel shuddered as she glimpsed the ledger's contents. She had seen it before, during the monthly rituals that had become as routine as Sunday church services, though infinitely more secretive. "But the cost, Father, the things we've had to do, the things we've had to provide," Cornelius corrected sharply. "Every great fortune requires sacrifice, my dear. The difference is that we've been honest about the price." Marcus felt a familiar chill run down his spine as he remembered the first time he had participated in one of the rituals. He had been 16, old enough to understand the gravity of what his family was involved in, but too young to fully comprehend the moral implications. Now, 12 years later, he carried the weight of dozens of such ceremonies, each one binding him deeper into a legacy he had never chosen but could never escape. "The reporter," Marcus said, returning to the immediate threat. "Thomas Hartwell from the Tribune. He's asking about the well, about the smell. If he starts digging into our family's history, then we'll handle him, as we've handled others who became too curious," Cornelius replied matter-of-factly. "The arrangement provides for such contingencies." A soft knock at the parlor door interrupted their conversation. Mrs. Catherine Brennan, the family's longtime housekeeper, entered with obvious reluctance. The Irish woman had served the Whitmores for 8 years, and her loyalty had been secured through generous wages and willful ignorance of her employer's more unusual activities. "Begging your pardon, Mr. Whitmore," she said, her accent thick with nervousness, "but there's a gentleman at the front door, says he's from the newspaper and would like to speak with you about the recent concerns in town." The 3 family members exchanged glances. Thomas Hartwell had arrived sooner than expected. "Show him to the front sitting room," Cornelius instructed. "Tell him I'll be with him shortly." After Mrs. Brennan departed, he turned to his children. "Marcus, go down to the cellar and check the seals. Make sure everything is secure. Isabel, find your mother and ensure she remains in her room. I'll speak with this reporter and determine exactly how much he knows." As his children moved to carry out their tasks, Cornelius straightened his tie and composed his features into the mask of respectability he had worn for decades. He had built his fortune on the ability to present one face to the world while hiding another, and today would be no different. Marcus descended the narrow stone steps that led to the mansion's cellar, each footfall echoing in the confined space. The basement had been extensively modified over the years, with additional rooms carved out of the earth and reinforced with stone and timber. But it was the central chamber that drew his attention, a circular room with walls lined in iron plates, all bearing the same strange symbols that adorned his father's ledger. At the center of the room stood the well. The ancient stone structure rose about 4 feet from the floor, its opening sealed by a massive iron cover that required 3 men to lift. The cover was held in place by heavy chains and locks, but Marcus could see that the metal was beginning to show signs of strain. Hairline cracks had appeared in several places, and a dark substance, neither water nor oil, had begun to seep through the gaps. The smell was overwhelming here, a nauseating blend of decay and something else, something that reminded Marcus of the copper taste that filled his mouth during the monthly rituals. He approached the well cautiously, noting that the seepage had increased significantly since his last inspection 3 days ago. As he knelt to examine the iron cover more closely, Marcus heard something that made his blood freeze. From deep within the well came a sound, not quite a voice, but something that carried the cadence of speech. The words, if they were words, were in no language he recognized, yet somehow he understood their meaning. Soon, the voice seemed to whisper, "The time grows short. The covenant weakens. Soon we shall rise." Marcus stumbled backward, his heart pounding. In 12 years of participating in his family's dark rituals, he had never heard the entity speak directly. The communication had always been through dreams, through the strange visions that came during the ceremonies, through the subtle signs that indicated their offerings had been accepted. But this was different. This was direct contact, and it terrified him more than anything he had experienced in his life. Upstairs, Cornelius Whitmore was greeting Thomas Hartwell with the practiced charm of a successful businessman, completely unaware that the foundation of their carefully maintained secret was beginning to crumble beneath their feet. Thomas Hartwell stepped into the Whitmore mansion's front sitting room, immediately struck by the oppressive atmosphere that seemed to permeate the elegant space. Despite the room's expensive furnishings, imported Persian rugs, mahogany furniture, and oil paintings in gilded frames, there was something fundamentally wrong with the environment. The air felt thick and stagnant, and the metallic smell that had been plaguing the town was noticeably stronger here, though subtle enough that someone might attribute it to the mansion's heating system or perhaps old pipes. Cornelius Whitmore entered the room with the measured stride of a man accustomed to command, his tall frame impeccably dressed in a charcoal wool suit despite the early hour. His handshake was firm, his smile practiced, but Thomas noticed that the older man's eyes remained cold and calculating throughout their initial pleasantries. "Mr. Hartwell, isn't it?" Cornelius settled into a leather chair across from Thomas, his posture relaxed but alert. "Mrs. Brennan mentioned you're with the Tribune. I must say, it's unusual for us to receive visitors from the press. We tend to keep to ourselves here." Thomas opened his notebook, his reporter's instincts immediately picking up on the subtle tension in Cornelius's voice. "I appreciate you taking the time to see me, Mr. Whitmore. I'm investigating some concerns that have been raised by residents in town regarding unusual odors emanating from your property." "Ah, yes." Cornelius's expression remained neutral, but Thomas caught a brief flicker of something, annoyance, fear, in the man's eyes. "I'm afraid that's a rather delicate matter. We've been dealing with some issues related to our well system." Old pipes, you understand. The winter weather has been particularly harsh on our infrastructure. Thomas made a note, though he suspected the explanation was far from complete. Several residents have described the smell as quite distinctive, metallic, with an almost sweet undertone. That seems unusual for typical plumbing problems. Does it? Cornelius's tone remained conversational, but Thomas sensed a sharpening of attention. I'm not an expert in such matters, Mr. Hartwell. Perhaps you should speak with our local plumber, though I believe he's currently in Colorado Springs on other business. The deflection was smooth, but Thomas had interviewed enough evasive subjects to recognize the technique. He decided to probe deeper. I've been researching the history of your property, Mr. Whitmore. Fascinating background. The previous owner, Ezekiel Thorne, seems to have disappeared under mysterious circumstances. For the first time, Cornelius's composure showed a crack. His fingers tightened almost imperceptibly on the arms of his chair, and when he spoke, his voice carried a note of warning. Mr. Hartwell, I purchased this land in good faith from the territorial government after Mr. Thorne's disappearance was legally established. Whatever happened to the previous owner has no bearing on my family's residence here. Of course not, Thomas agreed, though he continued writing. I'm simply trying to understand the complete picture. There are some interesting local legends about this area, stories about unusual occurrences, unexplained deaths. The Arapaho tribes apparently had specific beliefs about this land. Cornelius stood abruptly, moving to the window that overlooked the mansion's grounds. From this vantage point, Thomas could see the well structure in the center of the yard, a circular stone construction that looked far older than the house itself. The iron cover that sealed it was clearly visible, along with the heavy chains that secured it in place. Mr. Hartwell, Cornelius said without turning around, I'm a businessman, not a folklorist. I deal in facts, figures, and tangible results. The stories you're referring to are nothing more than frontier superstitions, the kind of tales that grow in isolated communities where people have too much time and too little education. Perhaps, Thomas replied, though he made another note about Cornelius's defensive reaction. But the current situation seems quite real. Sheriff Morrison visited your property yesterday, and according to several witnesses, he returned in a state of considerable distress. This time, Cornelius turned from the window, and Thomas saw something in the man's expression that made him instinctively lean back in his chair. For just a moment, the mask of civilized respectability slipped, revealing something cold and predatory beneath. Sheriff Morrison is a good man, but he's also prone to imagination, Cornelius said carefully. The stress of his position, combined with the isolation of frontier life, can sometimes lead to misinterpretations of perfectly ordinary situations. Thomas was about to respond when a sound from elsewhere in the house caught his attention, a woman's voice, raised in what sounded like distress or fear. The voice was coming from the upper floors, and though the words were indistinct, the emotional content was unmistakable. Your wife? Thomas asked, genuinely concerned. Cornelius's jaw tightened. Mrs. Whitmore has been unwell recently. The winter months are particularly difficult for her constitution. She sometimes experiences episodes. Another sound drifted down from above, not quite a scream, but something that made Thomas's skin crawl. It was followed by what sounded like heavy footsteps and a door slamming shut. Perhaps I should return at a more convenient time, Thomas suggested, though every instinct told him to stay and investigate further. That might be best, Cornelius agreed quickly. As you can see, this is not an ideal time for interviews. Perhaps you could focus your article on more pressing community concerns, the upcoming territorial elections, the expansion of the railroad, the growth of our mining industry. Thomas stood, recognizing that he was being dismissed but unwilling to leave without pushing for more information. Mr. Whitmore, I have to ask directly, is there anything happening on your property that might pose a danger to the community? The smell has been getting stronger, and people are genuinely frightened. Cornelius moved closer, and Thomas caught the full force of the man's intimidating presence. Despite being in his 60s, Cornelius radiated a kind of controlled menace that suggested he was far more dangerous than his refined appearance indicated. "Mr. Hartwell," Cornelius said quietly, "I've lived in this territory for over a decade. I've seen boomtowns rise and fall, watched fortunes made and lost, witnessed the kind of violence and chaos that comes with rapid expansion and limited law enforcement. In my experience, the greatest dangers to any community come not from mysterious smells or old legends, but from people who ask too many questions about matters that don't concern them." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Thomas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Colorado winter, but his journalistic instincts were stronger than his sense of self-preservation. "I appreciate the warning, Mr. Whitmore," he replied evenly, "but I have a responsibility to investigate matters of public concern. If there's nothing to hide, then surely transparency would be in everyone's best interest." Cornelius smiled, but the expression held no warmth. "Transparency is a luxury that successful men rarely enjoy, Mr. Hartwell. I've built my fortune by understanding when to speak and when to remain silent. I suggest you learn the same lesson." As Thomas was escorted to the front door by the nervous housekeeper, he caught a glimpse of a young woman on the main staircase, presumably Isabel Whitmore. She was pale and drawn, her dark hair disheveled, and when their eyes met briefly, he saw something that looked like a plea for help. But before he could react, she had disappeared back up the stairs, leaving Thomas with more questions than answers, and a growing certainty that the Whitmore family was hiding something far more sinister than faulty plumbing. As he walked back toward town, Thomas noticed that the smell seemed to follow him, clinging to his clothes and hair like an invisible stain. Behind him, the Whitmore mansion loomed against the grey winter sky, its windows watching his departure with what felt like malevolent attention. He had come seeking a story about a mysterious odor. He was beginning to suspect he had stumbled onto something much darker, something that the Whitmore family would kill to protect. That evening, Thomas Hartwell sat in his modest boarding room above Miller's General Store, surrounded by scattered notes and newspaper clippings he had gathered throughout the day. The single oil lamp cast dancing shadows on the walls as he tried to piece together the fragments of information he had collected about the Whitmore family and their mysterious property. His interview with Cornelius had raised more questions than it had answered, but it was the brief glimpse of Isabel Whitmore that haunted him most. The young woman's expression had conveyed a desperation that suggested she was as much a prisoner of whatever was happening at the estate as she was a participant. A soft knock at his door interrupted his thoughts. Thomas opened it to find Jake Morrison standing in the hallway, his face pale and his hands trembling slightly. "Jake, what brings you here so late?" "I need to talk to you, Thomas, about what you're investigating." Jake glanced nervously down the hallway before stepping into the room. "My brother Ben came home an hour ago, and he's not the same man who left this morning." Thomas gestured for Jake to sit in the room's single chair while he perched on the edge of his narrow bed. "What do you mean?" "He went back to the Whitmore place today, after you visited them. Said he needed to follow up on some concerns." Jake's voice was barely above a whisper. "When he came home, he locked himself in his study again, but this time I could hear him crying. Ben hasn't cried since our mother died 10 years ago." Thomas felt a chill run down his spine. Sheriff Morrison was known throughout Denver as one of the most level-headed and courageous men in the territory. Whatever he had seen at the Whitmore estate had clearly shaken him to his core. "Did he say anything about what he found?" Jake shook his head. "He won't talk about it directly, but he kept muttering something about the covenant and the price of prosperity. And Thomas." Jake leaned forward, his voice dropping even lower. "He made me promise to stay away from the Whitmore property, no matter what happens. He said some secrets are too dangerous to uncover." Thomas made notes as Jake spoke, his reporter's instincts warring with a growing sense of unease. "Jake, I need to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. Do you know of any way to access the Whitmore property without being seen from the house?" "Thomas, no. Whatever you're thinking, I'm thinking that people are frightened, and they have a right to know what's causing that fear," Thomas interrupted. "Your brother saw something that terrified him. The entire town is living under a cloud of anxiety because of whatever is happening on that property. As a journalist, I have a responsibility to investigate." Jake was quiet for a long moment, clearly wrestling with his conscience. Finally, he sighed and pulled out a hand-drawn map from his coat pocket. "There's an old mining trail that runs along the eastern edge of the Whitmore property. It connects to a network of abandoned tunnels that were dug during the early silver prospecting. Some of those tunnels come up near the well." Thomas studied the map, noting the careful detail with which Jake had marked the various passages and potential hazards. "You've been thinking about this." "I've been thinking about a lot of things since this smell started," Jake admitted. "My grandfather's stories about that well, the way the Whitmore family has always kept to themselves, the fact that their mines produce silver when everyone else's claims are running dry. There are too many coincidences, Thomas. Too many things that don't add up. Will you come with me?" Jake shook his head immediately. "I can't. I have a wife and children to think about, but Thomas..." He reached into his coat again and withdrew a small leather pouch. "Take this. It's blessed salt from Father Santos. My grandfather always said it provides protection against unnatural things." Thomas accepted the pouch, though he wasn't sure whether to be amused or concerned by the gesture. "Jake, you don't really believe in..." "I don't know what I believe anymore," Jake interrupted, "but I know that something is very wrong at the Whitmore estate, and if you're determined to investigate, you should take every precaution available." After Jake left, Thomas spent another hour studying the map and planning his approach. The mining trail would allow him to reach the property under cover of darkness, and the tunnel system would bring him close to the well without alerting the family to his presence. It was dangerous. The abandoned mines were notoriously unstable, but it seemed to be his only option for getting close enough to discover what the Whitmores were hiding. At midnight, Thomas gathered his supplies: a dark lantern, rope, his notebook and pencils, and Jake's pouch of blessed salt. He dressed in his darkest clothes and made his way quietly through the sleeping town toward the eastern hills where the mining trail began. The December night was brutally cold, with a wind that cut through his heavy coat and made his eyes water. The snow crunched under his boots as he followed Jake's map through the maze of abandoned mining claims and equipment that littered the hillside. Many of Denver's early prospectors had given up their claims when the easy silver played out, leaving behind a landscape scarred by their efforts. The entrance to the tunnel system was hidden behind a collapsed wooden structure that had once housed mining equipment. Thomas lit his lantern and squeezed through the narrow opening, immediately struck by the change in atmosphere. The tunnel was warmer than the outside air, but it carried a musty smell of earth and decay that reminded him uncomfortably of the odor emanating from the Whitmore property. Following Jake's map, Thomas navigated through a series of interconnected passages that had been carved out of the hillside by hopeful miners. Some of the tunnels were reinforced with timber, while others were simply rough holes in the earth that threatened to collapse at any moment. The lantern light created eerie shadows that seemed to move independently, and more than once Thomas had to stop and steady his nerves before continuing. After nearly an hour of careful progress, Thomas reached the tunnel that Jake had marked as leading toward the Whitmore well. This passage was different from the others, older with stone walls that showed signs of deliberate construction rather than hasty excavation. The symbols carved into the walls were unlike anything Thomas had seen before, resembling the strange markings he had glimpsed in Cornelius Whitmore's ledger. As he moved deeper into this tunnel, the smell that had been plaguing Denver grew stronger. But here, In the confined space underground, Thomas could detect additional odors that had been masked by the wind above ground. There was the metallic scent of blood, but also something else, something organic and corrupt that made his stomach turn. The tunnel began to slope upward, and Thomas realized he was approaching the Whitmore property from below. According to Jake's map, he should emerge near the well structure, hopefully concealed by the darkness and the various outbuildings that surrounded the main house. But as Thomas rounded a final bend in the tunnel, his lantern light revealed something that made him stop, dead in his tracks. The passage ahead was blocked by an iron gate, its bars thick and heavily corroded. Beyond the gate, Thomas could see that the tunnel continued for perhaps 20 feet before opening into what appeared to be a larger chamber. And from that chamber came sounds that no human throat should be able to produce. Thomas approached the gate cautiously, noting that it was secured by a heavy chain and lock that looked far newer than the gate itself. The sounds from beyond grew louder as he drew closer, a rhythmic chanting in a language he didn't recognize, punctuated by other noises that made his skin crawl. Peering through the bars, Thomas could see flickering light in the chamber beyond, as if from torches or candles. The chanting continued, and now he could make out multiple voices, at least 3, possibly more. One of them sounded like Cornelius Whitmore, though the words were in that strange, guttural language that seemed to bypass the ears and speak directly to some primitive part of the brain. Thomas realized he was witnessing some kind of ritual, and every instinct told him to retreat immediately. But his journalistic curiosity was stronger than his fear, and he found himself studying the lock that secured the gate. It was old but well maintained, and the keyhole was large enough that it might be possible to pick it with the right tools. As he examined the lock more closely, the chanting suddenly stopped. The silence that followed was somehow more terrifying than the sounds had been, and Thomas held his breath as he listened for any indication that his presence had been detected. Then from the chamber beyond came a new sound, something that was definitely not human. It was a low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from deep within the earth itself, followed by what sounded like massive chains being dragged across stone. Thomas's nerve finally broke. He turned and fled back through the tunnel system, his lantern casting wild shadows as he ran. Behind him, the inhuman sounds grew louder, and he could swear he heard footsteps pursuing him through the darkness. He didn't stop running until he emerged from the tunnel entrance and found himself back on the hillside above Denver. Only then did he allow himself to look back toward the Whitmore estate, where he could see lights moving in the basement windows and shadows that seemed far too large to be cast by human figures. Thomas Hartwell had come seeking answers about a mysterious smell. Instead, he had discovered that the Whitmore family was involved in something that defied rational explanation, something that posed a threat, not just to Denver, but possibly to anyone who came too close to their terrible secret. As he made his way back to town, Thomas began to plan his next move. He had enough evidence to write a story that would expose the Whitmores, but he also knew that such an article would put him in mortal danger. The family had clearly killed to protect their secret before, and they wouldn't hesitate to do so again. But Thomas was a journalist, and the truth was worth any risk. Tomorrow, he would begin writing the story that would either make his career or end his life. The next morning brought an unnatural stillness to Denver. The wind that had been carrying the metallic smell for days had died completely, leaving the air thick and oppressive despite the winter cold. Thomas Hartwell woke before dawn, his sleep having been plagued by nightmares of inhuman voices and shadows that moved independently of their sources. He had spent the early hours writing furiously, documenting everything he had witnessed and learned about the Whitmore family. The article was nearly complete, but Thomas knew that publishing it would require more than just his word against one of Denver's most prominent families. He needed proof, something tangible that would convince even the most skeptical reader that the Whitmores were involved in activities that threatened the entire community. As Thomas prepared to leave his boarding room, a commotion in the street below caught his attention. Looking out his window, he saw a crowd gathering near the town center, their voices raised in alarm. He quickly dressed and made his way downstairs to investigate. The crowd had assembled around Dr. Samuel Hayes, who was kneeling beside a figure lying motionless in the snow. As Thomas pushed through the gathered townspeople, he recognized the prone form of Sheriff Ben Morrison. The lawman was alive but unconscious, his face pale and his breathing shallow. "Found him like this about an hour ago," Dr. Hayes was explaining to the crowd. "He's lost a significant amount of blood, but I can't find any wounds. It's as if..." The doctor trailed off, unwilling to voice his suspicions. Thomas knelt beside the sheriff, noting the man's pallor and the way his clothes hung loosely on his frame, as if he had lost considerable weight overnight. But most disturbing were Morrison's eyes. When they occasionally fluttered open, they held a look of absolute terror that suggested he had seen something that had fundamentally broken his spirit. "We need to get him inside," Dr. Hayes said, gesturing for several men to help carry the sheriff. "But I have to tell you, I've never seen anything like this. It's as if something has drained the very life from him." As the crowd began to disperse, Thomas noticed a familiar figure watching from the edge of the group. Marcus Whitmore stood in the shadows between two buildings, his face drawn and his eyes fixed on the sheriff's unconscious form. When he realized Thomas was looking at him, Marcus quickly turned and disappeared into an alley. Thomas followed, his reporter's instincts overriding his caution. He found Marcus leaning against a brick wall, his hands shaking as he tried to light a cigarette. "Mr. Whitmore," Thomas called out, "I'd like to speak with you about what happened to Sheriff Morrison." Marcus looked up, and Thomas was shocked by the young man's appearance. In the 2 days since their brief encounter at the mansion, Marcus seemed to have aged years. His face was gaunt, his eyes were bloodshot, and his usually immaculate clothing was wrinkled and stained. "You don't understand what you're dealing with," Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You think this is just a story, something you can investigate and write about, but some secrets are too dangerous to expose." "Then help me understand," Thomas replied, moving closer. "Tell me what's really happening at your family's estate." Marcus laughed bitterly. "Well, what's happening? We're paying the price for 12 years of prosperity. We made a bargain, Mr. Hartwell, and now that bargain is coming due." "What kind of bargain?" For a moment, Marcus seemed on the verge of explaining everything. His mouth opened, and Thomas could see the desperate need to confess, warring with years of ingrained secrecy. But then, something changed in the young man's expression, a look of fear so profound that it seemed to physically pain him. "I can't," Marcus whispered. "If I tell you, it will know. It will come for me next, and then for you. The only way to survive is to stay silent and hope that the covenant holds." "The covenant is already broken," Thomas said, taking a calculated risk based on what he had overheard in the tunnel. "Sheriff Morrison's condition proves that. Whatever your family has been doing, it's spiraling out of control." Marcus's eyes widened. "How do you know about the covenant?" Thomas decided to reveal part of what he had discovered. "I know about the tunnel system. I know about the ritual chamber beneath your property. I know that your family has been involved in something that goes far beyond normal business practices." "You were in the tunnels?" Marcus grabbed Thomas's arm, his grip surprisingly strong. "When? Last night?" "Yes, and I heard..." "Then it's too late," Marcus interrupted, his voice filled with despair. "The entity knows about you now. It can sense anyone who comes too close to its domain. That's why Sheriff Morrison is dying. He got too close to the truth." Thomas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air. "What entity? What are you talking about?" Marcus released his grip and slumped against the wall. 12 years ago, our family was facing bankruptcy. The silver mines were playing out, our creditors were demanding payment, and we were about to lose everything. That's when my father found the old records, documents left behind by Ezekiel Thorne, the previous owner of our land. What did the records say? They described a ritual, a way to make contact with something that dwells beneath the earth, something ancient and powerful that could grant prosperity in exchange for offerings. Marcus's voice became barely audible. Thorne had tried to break free from the arrangement, and it cost him his life. But my father was desperate enough to try anyway. Thomas scribbled notes as quickly as possible, knowing that this might be his only chance to get the full story. What kind of offerings? At first, it was simple: animals, precious metals, things that could be obtained without arousing suspicion. But as our wealth grew, so did the entity's demands. It wanted more substantial offerings. The implication hit Thomas like a physical blow. People? Marcus nodded miserably. Travelers passing through, drifters who wouldn't be missed. Occasionally someone who asked too many questions about our family's business. We told ourselves it was necessary, that the prosperity we gained benefited the entire community. But the truth is, we became monsters. And now? Now the entity is growing stronger. The monthly offerings are no longer enough to satisfy it. It wants to break free from the well, to walk the earth again. And if that happens... Marcus shuddered. The things we've done to maintain our bargain will seem like mercy compared to what it will do to this entire territory. Thomas felt the weight of the story settling on his shoulders. This was bigger than just a corrupt family. This was a threat to everyone in Denver, possibly everyone in Colorado. How do we stop it? We can't, Marcus said flatly. The only way to contain it is to continue honoring the covenant, and even that may not be enough anymore. The iron seals are weakening, and the entity's influence is spreading beyond the well. There has to be another way. What about the original ritual? Could it be reversed? Marcus looked at Thomas with something approaching hope. Thorne's records mentioned a counter-ritual, a way to permanently seal the entity, but it would require... He paused, seeming to wrestle with himself. What would it require? The willing sacrifice of the family that made the original pact. All of us, my father, my mother, my sister and myself, our deaths would provide the power needed to reinforce the seals permanently. Thomas stared at the young man, realizing the full scope of the tragedy that had engulfed the Whitmore family. They were trapped between their own survival and the safety of everyone around them, and the weight of that choice was slowly destroying them. Marcus, Thomas said carefully, there might be another way. If we could expose what's happening, bring in experts, maybe find a solution that doesn't require your family's deaths. No, Marcus interrupted, his voice suddenly firm. You don't understand the power we're dealing with. This isn't something that can be solved by experts or authorities. This is ancient, primal evil that existed long before human civilization. The only language it understands is sacrifice and blood. A distant rumble interrupted their conversation, a sound that seemed to come from deep within the earth itself. Both men looked toward the Whitmore estate, where they could see smoke rising from the mansion's chimney despite the early hour. It's beginning, Marcus whispered. The final phase. Tonight, during the new moon, the entity will make its attempt to break free. If it succeeds, Denver will be the first to fall, but it won't be the last. Thomas felt the urgency of the situation pressing down on him. Then we have to act today. We have to find a way to stop this. Marcus looked at him with a mixture of admiration and pity. Mr. Hartwell, you're a brave man, but you're also a fool. The only way to stop this is for my family to complete the counter-ritual, and that means we all have to die. Are you prepared to write a story about a family that chose to sacrifice themselves to save a community that never knew it was in danger? Before Thomas could answer, another rumble shook the ground beneath their feet. This time, it was accompanied by a sound that made both men's blood freeze, a howl of rage and hunger that seemed to come from the very depths of hell itself. The entity was awakening, and time was running out. As Marcus hurried back toward his family's estate to prepare for what might be their final act, Thomas realized that he was about to witness and possibly participate in events that would either save Denver or doom it. The story he had been chasing had become a matter of life and death, not just for himself, but for everyone he had ever known. The covenant was broken, the seals were failing, and something ancient and evil was stirring beneath the Colorado earth. In a few hours, Thomas Hartwell would discover whether the Whitmore family had the courage to pay the ultimate price for their 12 years of prosperity, and whether their sacrifice would be enough to contain the horror they had unleashed. The final chapter of the Whitmore legacy was about to be written in blood and fire, and Thomas would be there to document every terrifying moment.